Hello everyone, friends. The evening is quiet, and the world outside your window has already turned into a shadow. There's no need to hurry here, nothing to decide quickly. We are in no hurry. After all, this is a story for the night. The topic may seem unusual at first. How to prevent unwanted pregnancy in the Middle Ages. It is a topic that carries a mixture of practical necessity, social importance, and quiet, almost secret traditions. But here, in this story, it will be approached gently, without urgency, without controversy. Only as a gentle exploration of the past, a quiet walk along old paths, with a slow turning of the pages in a medieval book. And before we get too deep into this long evening of wandering thoughts, let me whisper a reminder. If you find solace in this slow and winding narrative, if you enjoy the leisurely pace of a story told without rushing, be sure to subscribe to this channel. A simple like or quiet comment below helps keep this listening circle going. It's a small gesture, but one that goes a long way. So, subscribe, like, and share in the comments if you feel like it. Now, back to our gentle story. In the Middle Ages, life unfolded at a rhythm far slower than the one we know today. The rising of the sun and the setting of the same marked the boundaries of most human activity. Candles, torches, and the faint glow of the hearth could stretch a day a little longer. But still, the body was tied to the turning of the earth. The sound of the rooster's crow, the church bells at dawn, the fading light at dusk. These guided men and women more than clocks or schedules. And within this rhythm, families formed and households grew. Marriage, children, lineage, inheritance, these were not abstract ideas. They were the very fabric of daily survival. A child could be a blessing, a source of labor and hope for the future. Yet, at the same time, another child too soon, or too many children too close together, could also be a burden. Food was not always abundant. Work was heavy. Mothers were mortal, their health fragile with each birth. And so, even in an age deeply guided by religion and tradition, people thought quietly about how to prevent new life from beginning when the time was not right. Imagine, for a moment, a village in the 14th century. The houses are simple, timber frames, thatched roofs, clay floors, smoke curling slowly upward from the hearth inside. The night is cool, and the fields nearby are dark under the sky. Inside one of these houses sits a family. The father perhaps a farmer, his hands worn and calloused. The mother busy with wool, spinning slowly by firelight, her children dozing nearby. In this quiet space, conversations sometimes drift toward practical things. Food, the harvest, debts, the coming of winter. But also, privately, between husband and wife, there might be the unspoken worry of another child arriving too soon. It was not always voiced aloud. Sometimes it lived only in a glance, in the careful way they moved toward or away from one another. For pregnancy in the Middle Ages was both expected and yet feared in its excess. And so, methods, humble, imperfect, whispered about, existed to help shape the rhythm of life. We must be careful here. The Middle Ages did not have the medical knowledge that we take for granted. Ideas about the body were shaped by Galen, Hippocrates, and medieval physicians who thought in terms of humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. The womb was seen as a mysterious, sometimes even dangerous space. Conception was not entirely understood. The meeting of seed and seed, male and female, was explained with metaphors, with philosophy, with faith. And within this mist of partial understanding, people sought practical ways of managing fertility Herbs were one path. Whispered recipes passed among women, sometimes written in the margins of herbals, sometimes shared by midwives, sometimes condemned from pulpits. Another path was ritual, prayer, charms, and protective objects. Still another was physical practice, withdrawal, timing, and abstinence. None of this was spoken of too loudly, for to control fertility was to tread close to matters of sin, of obedience, of disobedience. Yet, in the hushed spaces of kitchens, fields, and small gardens, knowledge circulated, and this is where our story will take us. Not in the form of grand declarations or dramatic discoveries, but in the slow, almost invisible details of daily life. In the way herbs were dried and hung in rafters, in the rhythm of planting and harvesting, in the careful notes of physicians who wrote in Latin, and the everyday speech of women who remembered without writing at all. We will wander together, slowly through these details, through gardens of rue, pennyroyal, and sage, through the quiet halls of monasteries where books were copied, through the narrow streets of towns where merchants sold powders and potions, promising more than they could deliver, through the spaces of belief, where prayers were whispered for safety, health, and control of the body. We have placed it in its context. A world where families were both gifts and burdens, where knowledge was fragile, where faith guided many choices, and where daily survival sometimes made people seek hidden methods. From here, in the chapters to come, we will move deeper. We will examine how medieval people thought about fertility itself, what they believed about the body, and how that guided their attempts at prevention. We will listen to the voices of physicians, but also of peasants and midwives. We will walk through monasteries and gardens. We will let the story expand slowly until it becomes a long evening of reflection. But for now, let us rest in this beginning, a quiet opening. Like the first page of a very long book, let us walk a little further, slowly, with steady steps. We have set the stage with the idea that families in the Middle Ages lived in a rhythm of blessings and burdens, of gratitude and quiet concern. Now, to understand why and how they sought to control conception, we must pause and consider the way they viewed the body itself. For only through their understanding of fertility, shaped by philosophy, medicine, religion, and folk wisdom, can we see the choices they made. So let us open this long and gentle chapter. The body, in the Middle Ages, was not seen as we know it today. To us, anatomy is defined by science, by diagrams of organs, by biology lessons at school. But in the centuries between the fall of Rome and the rise of modern medicine, the body was explained differently. It was imagined through the theory of humors, a system inherited from the ancient physicians Hippocrates and Galen. 4 fluids, or humors, were thought to shape the body: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. These were tied to temperaments, to moods, to the balance or imbalance of health. A person with more blood was considered sanguine, lively, warm. Too much black bile made one melancholic. Flame was linked to calmness, to slowness. Yellow bile was tied to choler, to heat, to anger. And within this framework, fertility too was explained. For pregnancy, like illness or health, was the result of balances and imbalances. Medieval scholars often believed that both men and women produced a kind of seed. This was not entirely unlike the older Aristotelian theory, where the man was thought to provide the form and the woman the matter. But in Galenic thought, both contributed actively. The man with his seed, the woman with hers. Conception occurred when these 2 seeds met in harmony within the womb at the right time. in the right balance of heat and moisture. If the body was too cold, conception might fail. If too hot, it might be disrupted. If the womb was considered dry, then life might not grow. If too wet, the seed might be washed away. Thus, fertility was understood as a matter of bodily balance, and infertility as imbalance. Physicians might prescribe warming herbs to a woman thought too cold, or cooling diets to a man considered overheated. The womb itself was described in terms of metaphor and mystery, sometimes compared to a garden, a vessel, even an oven in which the seed was baked. Sometimes it was imagined as restless, capable of wandering within the body, if not anchored by intercourse or childbirth. A belief that women's ailments might come from a wandering womb, floating about inside. These ideas, strange to us now, were the foundation for how people thought about conception, and thus prevention. Beyond the body itself, the heavens were thought to guide fertility. The moon was especially important. Its cycles mirrored those of a woman's monthly bleeding, and so lunar phases were tied to ideas of when a woman might conceive or not. Astrology was not simply superstition, but a serious intellectual field. Learned men consulted charts to predict the best time for healing, for planting, for travel, and also for intercourse. Some believed that certain constellations favored conception, while others hindered it. The alignment of the stars could determine whether a child would be male or female, strong or weak, fortunate or cursed. Thus, avoiding conception could sometimes mean avoiding intimacy during certain phases of the moon or under certain signs in the heavens. A kind of cosmic calendar influenced choices alongside herbs and household practices. And of course, one cannot separate the medieval body from the medieval soul. For the church spoke often about sex, about fertility, about the duties of marriage. The body was seen as both sacred and flawed, a vessel of life, but also of temptation. Marriage was encouraged for procreation. To have children was considered a duty, a participation in God's creation. Yet at the same time, clerics spoke against lust, against sex for pleasure alone. To avoid pregnancy deliberately could, in some teachings, border on sin. The spilling of seed outside the proper act of procreation was condemned, often compared to the sin of Onan in the Bible. Thus, the church's voice was one of tension. On one hand, urging couples to accept children as gifts. On the other, acknowledging the real burdens and dangers that too many children could bring. Yet despite these prohibitions, practices continued quietly. The human desire to shape one's family size was stronger than sermons alone. Alongside the words of physicians and priests lived another form of knowledge. Practical, domestic, shared among women in kitchens and gardens. A mother might advise her daughter to avoid intimacy during certain days after bleeding. A neighbor might whisper of herbs that cool the womb. A midwife might carry a bundle of charms, herbs, and wisdom passed from older generations. This knowledge was not written in grand books of medicine. It was spoken, remembered, lived, and it shaped how people understood fertility on a daily level. Let us pause and picture such a moment. A small village, somewhere in England, perhaps in the 13th century. A young woman, newly married, seeks advice from her mother. The room smells faintly of herbs drying overhead, of wood smoke from the hearth. The mother speaks softly, explaining that after her monthly bleeding, there are days best avoided if she does not wish to conceive too soon. She may suggest certain teas, bitter in taste, but thought to keep the womb from quickening. She may pass along prayers, quiet charms to say under one's breath. The daughter listens. not entirely sure which words are science, which are faith, which are simply tradition. But she accepts them, for in her world, knowledge was woven together in this way. It is important to remember that in the Middle Ages, much remained mysterious. Without microscopes, without the modern knowledge of ovulation or sperm, understanding was shaped by what could be observed with the eyes. Bleeding, swelling, pregnancy, miscarriage. These were visible, but the hidden processes remained opaque. And so, explanations leaned on metaphor, on analogy. The womb as soil, the seed as grain, the joining of man and woman as planting. Too much heat and the crop withers, too much cold and it will not grow. These agricultural images made sense in a world where most people lived close to the land. Medieval people did not see the body as we do. Their knowledge was partial, symbolic, guided by humors, by the heavens, by the church, and by tradition. It was within this framework that methods of prevention arose. They sought not simply to block conception, but to guide the body into balance, to align with the stars, to respect or bend the words of the church. In the next section, we will move further to the role of religion and moral teaching, to how the church shaped, encouraged, and discouraged these practices. The candle still burns quietly at our side, and the night outside is deepened. The story continues, softly, like water flowing over stone. We've already spoken of the medieval body, of humors, of seeds, of the womb as a vessel of mystery. Now it is time to turn to another shaping force of the Middle Ages, the Church. For in that long stretch of centuries, from roughly the 5th to the 15th, no institution spoke more loudly or more softly into the lives of ordinary people than the Church. Its bells measured time, its words marked morality, its sacraments defined the milestones of birth, marriage, and death. And so, when it came to the matter of fertility, of pregnancy, and of preventing it, the Church's voice was ever present. Sometimes harsh, sometimes tender, sometimes ignored, sometimes obeyed, but always there, like a slow, steady drum in the background of life. Let us begin by picturing the parish church of a small village. The building is simple. Stone walls, a wooden door, a bell tower that leans a little. Inside, light filters through narrow windows, colored faintly by glass. The air smells of wax, of incense, of damp stone. The priest stands before his flock, his voice carrying through the nave. On a Sunday morning, after the reading of the Gospel, he delivers a sermon. His words may speak of sin and virtue, of Adam and Eve, of the holy duties of marriage. He tells his people that to marry is to accept the call of God, to bring forth children, that the purpose of intimacy is not pleasure, but procreation, that the union of man and wife must remain open to life, as God intended. To the villagers, these words are not abstract. They shape what is right and wrong, what is whispered and what is hidden. They remind them that even in the most private of acts, the Church is present, guiding, watching. The Church taught that marriage was a holy sacrament. Within marriage, sexual relations were not only permitted, but sanctified, as long as they were directed toward the possibility of children. To seek pleasure for its own sake, or to avoid the gift of life, was frowned upon, sometimes condemned. Writers like St. Augustine, centuries earlier, had spoken sternly of lust. To him, sex was always tainted by desire, by concupiscence, by the fallen state of humanity after Adam and Eve. Yet within marriage, it could serve its purpose. It could bring forth children. By the medieval period, these teachings were woven into canon law, into confessional manuals, into sermons. To avoid pregnancy deliberately was often seen as interfering with God's will. The spilling of seed outside its proper purpose was condemned, associated with the sin of Onan in Genesis, who spilled his seed on the ground. This story was repeated often, used as a warning. We must also imagine the confessional. A man or woman kneels before the priest. Their sins are spoken aloud, quietly, sometimes trembling. Among the questions asked by confessors in certain manuals were those about sexual behavior. Did the couple avoid intercourse during fertile times, not for piety but to avoid children? Did they use means, charms, or potions to prevent conception? Did the man withdraw before completion? Did they seek pleasure in ways not open to life? Each of these could be confessed as sin. The penance might be prayers, fasting, almsgiving. Sometimes harsher, sometimes gentler, depending on priest and place. This culture of confession meant that people lived not only with the practical concerns of pregnancy, but also with the moral weight of how they sought to control it. The decision was never purely physical. It was also spiritual. And yet, despite these teachings, reality was persistent. Families already struggling with hunger, with illness, with land too small to divide among too many heirs, could not always welcome another mouth. A woman exhausted from multiple pregnancies, her body frail, might fear another birth. Thus, while the church preached openness to life, people quietly sought ways to limit it. Herbs passed from hand to hand. Advice whispered in kitchens, abstinence practiced at certain times under the guise of piety, though with practical intent. It was a quiet negotiation between obedience and survival, between faith and necessity. The sermons thundered, but life whispered differently. If we move from the village to the university, from the parish priest to the learned theologian, the tone shifts, but the theme remains. Thomas Aquinas, the great thinker of the 13th century, wrote about natural law and divine order. To him, sex must follow its natural purpose. Acts that prevented procreation were unnatural, contrary to God's design. These teachings were not abstract. They guided confessional practice, shaped canon law, influenced how priests advised the faithful. Other theologians echoed similar views. The prevention of pregnancy was not praised as prudence, but condemned as selfishness or sin. The ideal remained: to accept as many children as God sent, trusting in providence. We should not forget the other side of medieval Christianity, the monastic world. For monks and nuns, the path was celibacy, total renunciation of sexual life. In their eyes, to avoid pregnancy was simple: to avoid sex entirely. The monastery offered one solution to the problem of fertility: a life without it. And yet, even here in the silence of cloisters, the issue of fertility appeared. Monks copied texts that included medical treatises on reproduction. Nuns, some of whom were healers and midwives, carried herbal knowledge that could aid or hinder conception. The knowledge was never entirely separated from the religious world. For the ordinary person, the church's voice was strong, but not absolute. They heard sermons, yes. They confessed, yes. But they also lived in a world full of other voices: neighbors, family, tradition. Thus, while the church might say one thing, a woman might still brew a tea of pennyroyal to delay a pregnancy. A man might still withdraw, even knowing it was frowned upon. A couple might still time their intimacy, guided by the moon, despite the priest's warnings. The church's influence was real, shaping morality, shaping guilt, shaping language. But practice was shaped also by necessity. The medieval world was not uniform. Not every priest was strict. Not every theologian thundered. Not every couple obeyed. There was variation, nuance, quiet flexibility. Just as today, individuals found their own balance between belief and practice. And so, when we think of the Church's influence, we should imagine not a single hammer striking down, but a steady drumbeat, sometimes loud, sometimes faint, always present in the background of medieval life. And yet, daily life created its own pressures, and people quietly sought paths around the prohibitions. The tension between faith and necessity shaped how knowledge was passed, how practices were hidden, how guilt was carried. In the next section, we will leave the pulpit and the confessional behind and walk into the herbal gardens, the fields, the cupboards of kitchens. We will examine the plants and potions that people believed could prevent conception, the herbal knowledge of the Middle Ages. Picture, if you will, a small medieval garden. It might belong to a peasant family, fenced with woven wood, close to the house. Or it might be part of a monastery, enclosed by cloister walls, carefully tended by monks who copied texts and cultivated plants at the same time. The garden smells of soil and herbs. Rue grows here, its sharp, bitter scent carried in the air. Pennyroyal, with its small purple flowers, hides between other plants. Sage, with its gray-green leaves, offers itself for cooking, for medicine, for ritual. Parsley, not just for flavor, but for its supposed powers over the womb. And above, hanging from rafters or beams in kitchens, bundles of dried plants wait to be brewed into teas or crushed into powders. These were the tools available to women and men in the Middle Ages. Humble plants, familiar to hand and tongue, yet layered with meanings and hopes. Rue was often spoken of as a plant of strength, a protector. Its bitter taste and strong scent made it a favorite for warding off evil spirits, for driving away pests, and, as some believed, for preventing conception. In herbals, rue was described as warming, as stimulating the body. Physicians wrote that it could provoke menstruation, and by doing so, might also prevent pregnancy. A woman who wished to delay conception might chew its leaves or brew it in a tea, though the bitterness was strong. Midwives sometimes recommended it, though always with caution, for in stronger doses, rue could be harmful. This duality, helpful in small amounts, dangerous in larger ones, was common with many herbs. Another plant, often whispered of, was pennyroyal. With its small purple blossoms and its sharp, mint-like fragrance, pennyroyal was both familiar and feared. It was used as a flavoring in some dishes, but more often as a medicine. Women drank it as a tea to bring on menstruation, to cool the womb, or to prevent pregnancy after intimacy. Ancient texts had praised its powers. Roman authors like Pliny the Elder wrote of pennyroyal's effects on the womb, and that knowledge traveled forward into medieval times. In manuscripts copied by monks, pennyroyal's properties were recorded again and again. But like rue, pennyroyal was dangerous in excess. In later centuries, it became notorious for causing poisoning when taken in too great a dose. In the Middle Ages, people likely knew its risks, at least in part. Still, it remained in the repertoire of herbs used to shape fertility. Sage was another plant of many meanings. Its very name, from the Latin salvia, meant to save, to heal. It was used for digestion, for wounds, for colds. Yet it was also linked to the womb. Some texts suggested that sage might help regulate bleeding, that it might aid or hinder conception, depending on its preparation. Parsley, so familiar to us as a garnish, carried different associations in the Middle Ages. Its seeds, when brewed into a drink, were said to bring on menstruation. Women might chew the seeds or steep them in wine. The link between parsley and the womb was strong enough that it appeared in many herbal recipes. Juniper berries, sometimes taken in small amounts for their supposed power to cleanse the body. Mugwort, associated with women's cycles, with both easing pain and influencing conception. Wild carrot, sometimes called Queen Anne's lace, its seeds rumored to prevent pregnancy if chewed after intercourse. Savory catnip, fennel, all found their way into recipes meant to shape fertility. Some of these herbs may indeed have had mild effects. Some were purely symbolic, their powers more believed than proven. But in the kitchens and gardens of medieval Europe, they formed a network of quiet remedies. Often, they were brewed into teas, steeped in hot water, then drunk slowly. The bitterness was a sign, to medieval minds, of their strength. Sometimes they were ground into powders and mixed with wine or ale. Sometimes chewed raw, though the taste could be harsh. In some cases, they were worn, tucked into amulets, carried in pouches, placed under pillows. The line between medicine and magic was thin. A herb might be both remedy and charm, both physical and spiritual. And often, these remedies were shared from woman to woman. A mother teaching her daughter, a midwife advising her patient, a neighbor whispering to another. In monasteries and universities, more formal knowledge was recorded. Herbals, books describing plants and their uses, were copied carefully by hand. One might open such a book and find an illustration of a plant, drawn in ink and colored with pigments. Beside it, a description in Latin, noting its qualities, hot or cold, dry or moist, in which humor it acted, for which ailments it was prescribed. Rue might be described as hot and dry, useful against worms, against poison, and for provoking the menses. Pennyroyal listed as hot, good for digestion, for the lungs, and also for purging the womb. Wild carrot mentioned as helpful for stomach troubles and whispered about for its powers to prevent conception. These books were not common in every household, but their knowledge sometimes filtered down through physicians, through midwives, through travelers. Let us pause and imagine a scene. A woman in a small cottage, perhaps in France, perhaps in Germany, in the 13th century. She has 3 children already, and her body feels weary. Her husband is kind, but practical. They know another child, too soon, would be difficult. She goes to her neighbor, an older woman, known for her knowledge of herbs. The neighbor listens, nods, and takes down a bundle of dried pennyroyal from the rafters. She breaks off a small portion, instructs her in how to brew it. She warns her not to drink too much, to take care. The young woman returns home, boils water, prepares the tea. She sips it slowly, grimacing at the taste. She does not know if it will work, but she trusts the tradition, the shared wisdom, the long chain of voices that carried this knowledge forward. It is important to note, gently, that medieval people did not draw sharp lines between medicine, magic, and prayer. An herb might be taken with a whispered charm. A potion might be blessed with the sign of the cross. A remedy might be as much about belief as about chemistry. To them, the world was full of connections. Plants grew under the influence of stars. Herbs carried powers given by God. Words and rituals could shape outcomes. Thus, preventing pregnancy was not simply a matter of swallowing a plant, but of engaging in a web of practices, physical, spiritual, symbolic. Of course, not all of these remedies were safe. Some herbs were toxic in high doses. Some caused sickness, even death. Without precise measurements, without clear distinctions, people experimented, hoped, trusted. And yet, despite the risks, the use continued. For the alternative, another pregnancy, another burden, another danger in childbirth, was itself a risk. Thus, families weighed dangers quietly, choosing which seemed less heavy. In the quiet landscapes of the Middle Ages, when knowledge was fragile and uncertain, people often turned to practices that lived halfway between faith and custom, between inherited wisdom and whispered stories. While church teachings and learned physicians had their voices, so too did midwives, herbalists, and the ordinary folk who believed that life's greatest mysteries, birth, love, and death, were bound together by forces that could not be fully explained. And so, to guard against unwanted pregnancies, people often turned to rituals, charms, and superstitions. These were not always written in books, nor sanctioned by religious leaders, but were carried in memory, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, from neighbor to neighbor, from the hushed corners of a hearth to the quiet walk of a shepherd across the fields. We will now move slowly through these beliefs. Each custom may seem quaint to us today, or even puzzling, but in their own time, they were deeply serious. They gave comfort. They gave a sense of agency in a world where little could be controlled. And above all, they reflected the deeply human desire to influence destiny in some small way. In many medieval households, people believed that physical objects, worn or carried on the body, could ward off pregnancy just as they might ward off illness or evil spirits. Amulets were common. A small carved stone, a knotted cord, or even a scrap of parchment inscribed with words from Scripture could be carried near the skin. Some women tied knots in threads of red wool and wore them around their waist. The knots themselves were thought to bind fertility, to tie it up and prevent conception. Others sought protection from the animal world. Teeth from certain creatures, bones polished smooth, or even dried parts of small animals were sometimes fashioned into charms. A hare's foot hung discreetly beneath clothing was one such example. It was not just an ornament. It was believed to interrupt the mysterious forces of generation. There were also stones, the so-called hag stone, a stone with a natural hole through its center, was kept in cottages and sometimes tied near the bed. It was thought to protect not only against witches, but also against ill-timed fertility. Carrying one in a pouch was believed to ensure that a woman might enjoy intimacy without the consequence of childbearing. We cannot know how much faith was placed in these objects, but they appear again and again in records, in trial documents, and in the notes of traveling clerics who remarked upon the curious practices of villagers. Just as objects were thought to carry power, so too were words. Spells, blessings, and whispered charms belonged to the world of everyday life. Some women were taught to recite short prayers, not always from the church, but sometimes strange phrases that sounded half Latin, half vernacular. These were said at the moment of intimacy, or immediately after. For example, one charm from a medieval manuscript instructed a woman to repeat a phrase while turning her body 3 times, as if circling her fate. The phrase itself was a string of sounds, almost meaningless to us now, but carrying weight in its rhythm and mystery. Another practice was to call upon the names of saints. Saint Margaret, often associated with childbirth, was sometimes invoked in the opposite sense, her name spoken to delay or prevent conception. Words like these were believed to carry real force, not metaphorical, but practical and immediate. In villages, midwives often guarded these charms carefully. to reveal them too freely would diminish their strength, or so it was believed. Thus, they were passed in whispers, protected as if they were treasures, beyond objects and words. The body itself could become part of ritual. Gestures and movements, performed with precision, were believed to shape the outcome of an encounter. One such custom was for a woman to rise immediately after intimacy and perform a simple but deliberate action, such as hopping backward 3 times or walking in a circle around the bed. The direction mattered, whether clockwise or counterclockwise, depending on local tradition. These movements were believed to disrupt the natural flow of conception. There were also recommendations involving water. Some women were told to cross running water directly after intimacy, stepping over a stream or small brook. The flowing water was thought to carry away the seed, much as it carried away dirt and waste. In areas where streams were not nearby, the symbolic act of stepping over a basin of water was sometimes substituted. These practices might appear curious, but to those who believed, they carried deep reassurance. They offered something to do in the face of uncertainty, a ritual to hold on to when control felt otherwise impossible. The rhythms of the natural world were seen as inseparable from the rhythms of the body. The moon, with its steady cycle, was closely tied to beliefs about fertility. Some women were taught to avoid intimacy during certain phases of the moon, believing that conception was more likely when the moon was waxing, and less likely when it was waning. A full moon, bright and round, was thought to invite fertility, while a dark moon promised protection. In agricultural communities, this belief mirrored the way planting and harvesting were tied to lunar cycles. Just as seeds were sown with the waxing moon, so too was human seed thought to be more powerful at that time. Thus, abstaining during those nights became a form of natural contraception, rooted in cosmic order. Astrological charts, for those who could afford them, sometimes offered more precise guidance. Learned men and women cast horoscopes not only for kings and nobles, but also for households who wished to know when conception might be avoided. Not all practices were gentle or symbolic. Some leaned toward the darker side of superstition. There are accounts of women burying small objects at crossroads, pins, hair, or scraps of cloth, believing that leaving a trace of themselves there would confuse or distract the spirits that governed fertility. Crossroads were liminal places where ordinary rules did not apply, and so they became sites of magical bargaining. In rare cases, more unsettling rituals are described, though often in texts written by clerics condemning them. For example, placing certain parts of animals beneath the bed, or even using ashes from burned herbs inscribed with charms. The goal was the same: to interrupt the natural order and prevent conception. We must remember, however, that these accounts often come to us through hostile voices. Those who disapproved of such practices and wished to portray them as dangerous or sinful. Whether ordinary women truly practiced them widely is less certain. All of these customs, whether harmless amulets, whispered words, or elaborate rituals, shared a common thread. They gave women and men some sense of influence over one of life's greatest uncertainties. In a world without modern medicine, without reliable knowledge of how conception occurred in detail, and without the ability to control it, people turned to what they could: the tangible, the symbolic, the mystical. These rituals may not have changed biology, but they shaped psychology. They provided comfort, structure, and meaning. And perhaps, in that sense, they did work. For belief itself carries power, the power to ease the mind, to calm the heart, to let one rest more easily after a night of worry. The medieval world was steeped in religion. Everyday life, from the rising of the sun to the tolling of the evening bells, was marked by rhythms of prayer, worship, and ritual. The church stood, quite literally, at the center of towns and villages, its spire rising above the rooftops like a watchful guardian. For many men and women, questions of life, of birth, and of family were not just practical concerns. They were spiritual concerns, matters not only of the body, but also of the soul. When we speak of prevention of pregnancy in the Middle Ages, we cannot separate the practices from the moral framework in which they existed. The church was both a source of guidance and a source of restriction. It offered comfort, but it also set boundaries, teaching its followers what was acceptable and what was considered sinful. Let us begin slowly with the idea of marriage. In the medieval imagination, marriage was not only a social contract, but also a sacrament. It was meant to reflect divine order, and within it, the purpose of sexual relations was often framed in terms of procreation. Children were seen as blessings, gifts from God, signs of His providence. A family that grew was thought to mirror abundance. A barren household, meanwhile, might be considered under divine disfavor. And yet, behind this idealized picture, human realities persisted. Families lived in poverty, fields failed. Parents wondered how they might feed another mouth. A woman, already weary with the burdens of childbirth, might dread the thought of another pregnancy. And so, even as religious authorities preached openness to life, people sought ways to exert some control. But what of the clergy's position? Theologians, monks, and priests wrote long treatises on morality, on the proper place of intimacy, and on the sins of excess. They often condemned practices that interfered with conception, calling them unnatural or even aligned with dark forces. In confessionals, priests might warn parishioners that seeking to avoid children was to distrust God's will. At the same time, not all religious guidance was so rigid. In certain cases, church teachings allowed for periods of abstinence. Times of fasting, such as Lent or Advent, were often accompanied by prohibitions on marital relations. Newly married couples were sometimes advised to abstain during holy days or before receiving the Eucharist. By weaving these instructions into the calendar, the Church indirectly gave couples moments where intimacy, and by extension conception, was postponed. It was not framed as prevention, but as piety. Still, the effect could be the same. One can imagine the slow rhythm of life in a village. The seasons marked not only by planting and a harvest, but also by the cycle of feasts and fasts. The bells called men and women to prayer, but they also structured their intimacy. In the quiet of a candlelit chamber, a couple might recall the priest's words, that this was a time of abstinence. And so, willingly or reluctantly, they would wait. Beyond abstinence, there were also moral discourses around desire itself. Excessive lust was condemned. Moderation was praised. In this way, the Church did not only guide actions, but sought to shape the inner attitudes of believers. The act of restraint was elevated, and restraint often meant fewer children, even if it was not described in such practical terms. There is also the matter of confession. In the hush of the confessional booth, a woman might confess her fears of bearing too many children. A man might admit to seeking ways to limit his family. The priest would listen, perhaps offer penance, and remind them of God's law. For some, this may have reinforced guilt. For others, it was perhaps a moment of relief, a chance to voice the heavy weight of their concerns. even if absolution came with warning. The intertwining of morality and medicine is also worth noting. Some remedies, herbs, charms, or concoctions, were labeled sinful, not only because they interfered with nature, but because they were thought to border on witchcraft. Women who turned to folk healers, wise women, or midwives for such knowledge might risk accusation. At the same time, these practices persisted quietly, spoken in whispers, handed down like secret prayers. The relationship between religion and prevention, then, was not one of simple prohibition. It was a landscape of nuance. On one side, the church encouraged large families and discouraged interference with procreation. On the other, it prescribed rhythms of abstinence, elevated restraint, and acknowledged human frailty. Between these poles, everyday people navigated their lives, sometimes obeying, sometimes bending, sometimes ignoring. We may also reflect on how sermons shaped the collective imagination. Priests often use stories of saints, martyrs, and biblical figures to illustrate virtue. Women like the Virgin Mary were praised as models of obedience, purity, and motherhood. Yet, other figures, such as barren women in Scripture who later bore children through divine intervention, showed that fertility was not always in human hands. These narratives reminded listeners that the mystery of conception belonged to God. For the common believer, this could inspire faith or resignation. As the candles flickered on church altars, as incense rose in slow spirals, men and women contemplated their place in this order. Perhaps they feared the priest's judgment. Perhaps they clung to the idea that avoiding pregnancy was sinful. Or perhaps they simply kept their secrets, doing what they felt necessary for survival, while still kneeling in prayer each Sunday. The story of religion and morality in this subject is not one of stark opposition, but of tension, of ideals set by the church, and the quiet persistence of human need, of sermons thundering against sin, and whispered conversations in kitchens and fields where families made choices the pulpit did not sanction. It is within this space, between doctrine and daily life, that medieval men and women truly lived. Their actions, like the ringing of bells fading into the distance, were sometimes in harmony with religious teaching, and sometimes only an echo, softened, reshaped, almost unrecognizable. Knowledge of midwives and healers. In the stillness of village life, when the field stretched out in quiet rows and the church bell marked the rhythm of each passing day, there were always a few figures who held within them a different kind of knowledge. They were not priests, though the community sometimes went to them for guidance. They were not scholars, though their memory carried centuries of unwritten learning. They were midwives and healers, women and occasionally men, who bore in their minds and hands the careful traditions of caring for the body. In the Middle Ages, their role in preventing unwanted pregnancy was both subtle and important. Their knowledge was not stored in books with gilded edges. It was whispered from grandmother to granddaughter, from apprentice to mentor, passed down in kitchens, by hearths, and in the hushed corners of birthrooms lit only by flickering lamps. Their wisdom lived not on parchment, but in practice, observation, and the repeated experience of hundreds of births and their aftermaths. When we try to picture these midwives, we may imagine women of quiet strength. Their clothes would have been plain, perhaps a simple wool gown, faded with use, covered with an apron marked by the traces of herbs they had ground, or the soot of fires they tended while preparing poultices. Their hands were calloused but gentle, familiar with the textures of linen. the warmth of infants and the rough bark of plants they used in remedies. Their eyes carried patience, for their work required long hours of waiting, comforting, and steadying those who labored. The knowledge they held was broad. They knew how to ease a birth with warm compresses or whispered prayers. They knew how to tend wounds with salves made of honey, vinegar, or oils. They also carried, within their repertoire, methods intended to regulate fertility. These methods were not precise by the standards of modern science, but they were grounded in observation. Patterns noticed over time, outcomes remembered across generations. A midwife might have advised a woman to take a certain infusion of herbs, believed to warm or cool the womb, depending on the desired effect. She might recommend abstinence during certain days of the moon cycle, based not on biological understanding, but on rhythms believed to influence conception. She might also prepare mixtures intended to act as emmenagogues, substances that, according to their tradition, would bring on a woman's monthly bleeding if it seemed delayed. Herbal knowledge was central to their role. Plants like pennyroyal, rue, or juniper berries were sometimes used, though not always with safe results. Midwives did not measure with scales or carefully calibrated spoons. They measured with handfuls, pinches, and the memory of how strong a tea should taste. They knew that too much could harm, too little could be ineffective, and they lived in a space of delicate balance, learned only by long practice. Beyond plants, there were practices rooted in ritual. Some midwives tied amulets around the waist or recommended charms said to protect against conception. Others might burn herbs as fumigation, believing the smoke could purify the womb. Some of these actions carried little physical effect, but they provided comfort, an assurance that the woman had taken steps, that her will to avoid pregnancy had been marked and made visible. The healer's house, or the corner of a room where she worked, might have smelled of dried herbs hung from rafters, sage, rosemary, lavender. On shelves or in baskets were roots, barks, and seeds gathered from hedgerows and forest edges. Mortars and pestles rested close at hand, worn smooth from use. In this setting, practical and spiritual blended together. The act of preparing a remedy was also an act of intention, and the midwife's presence lent it quiet authority. Midwives also carried social knowledge. They understood not only the body, but the community. A woman who came seeking their advice might do so in whispers, careful not to be overheard, for not all looked kindly on such practices. Church authorities warned against interference with God's will in matters of fertility. Neighbors might gossip. Yet, within the trust between midwife and client, such concerns could be softened. Midwives lived within the very fabric of their communities. They were daughters, sisters, mothers themselves. This gave them credibility and made their guidance accessible in ways formal medicine could not provide. It is important to remember that much of this knowledge was fragile. It could be lost if a healer died without passing it on. It could be silenced if suspicion arose, leading to accusations of witchcraft. But still, it endured because the need was constant. Women turned to midwives not only for birth, but for the quieter wish to avoid it. And so the chain of knowledge continued, link by link, generation after generation. If we listen closely, we can almost hear the sounds of that world. The low murmur of women speaking together, the rustle of linen as herbs are wrapped in cloth bundles, the crackle of fire beneath an iron pot. We can imagine the soft clink of a wooden spoon against a clay vessel as an infusion is stirred. These were the sounds of care, repeated countless times, forming a rhythm of everyday healing. And when the midwife finished her work, she might offer a few words of reassurance, not promises, for she knew that certainty was beyond her reach. But gentle reminders: rest, drink of this, trust the rhythm of your body. For the women who sought her guidance, these words carried weight. They were not spoken in the language of doctors or priests, but in the language of lived experience, the language of mothers and daughters who shared the burdens of fertility. In this way, the midwives and healers of the Middle Ages became quiet custodians of one of the most intimate aspects of human life. Their knowledge was imperfect, sometimes risky, but it was also deeply human. It spoke to the universal wish to shape one's future, to find some measure of control within the uncertainties of the body. The hour grows late, and the story now drifts toward the cool, echoing cloisters of medieval monasteries and the quiet, parchment-scented chambers of early universities. Within these walls, knowledge was carefully guarded, written by hand, copied with patience, and passed on not in the voices of the marketplace, but in whispers of scholarship. In these places of learning, the question of how life began and how it might be guided or restrained was discussed not only as a matter of practice, but also as a matter of philosophy, theology, and natural science. Let us step slowly, without hurry, into this world of silence and parchment. Monastic libraries were often dim places, with narrow windows set high in the stone walls, letting in only a pale thread of daylight. The air was cool, the scent of vellum and ink lingering long after the scribes had left their desks. Monks bent over manuscripts, copied texts with careful strokes, each letter formed as though it were a prayer in itself. Among the works they preserved were not only holy scriptures, but also medical writings inherited from the ancient world. Greek treatises of Hippocrates, the Roman compilations of Galen, the philosophical musings of Aristotle, all found their way into Latin, and from Latin into the hands of medieval scholars. Such writings spoke of the human body, of humors and balance, of fertility and conception. Yet they were read not only as guides for healing, but also as mysteries to be reconciled with faith. The monks themselves, bound by vows of chastity, did not need this knowledge for their own lives. But they copied it faithfully, believing that all learning was a reflection of divine order. To understand the cycles of the moon, or the movement of the stars, or the workings of the womb, was in some way to understand the Creator's hand. So, within those walls, knowledge of reproduction survived. Sometimes it was practical, an herbal recipe, or a description of bodily signs. Sometimes it was abstract, lists of humors, or the belief that the female body was simply a cooler, less perfect version of the male. Such ideas might seem strange now, but they formed the foundation of how people thought of fertility for centuries. At the same time, beyond the monasteries, in the growing towns of Europe, a new kind of learning was taking shape. The first universities, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, opened their doors to students who came to sit in cold lecture halls, their wax tablets balanced on their knees, listening to a master reading from an ancient text. These halls were not lively places of debate as we might imagine. Instead, the pace was slow, deliberate. A teacher would read line by line from Galen or Aristotle. Students, many still young, copied every word carefully. Sometimes the master would pause, explain a difficult term, or add a commentary drawn from his own teachers. In this way, knowledge passed on, layer by layer, slowly like ink soaking into parchment. Among the subjects most often read were the so-called books of generation. These texts sought to explain how life began, what role the man and woman each played, and under what conditions a child might be conceived. Some passages described timing, when a woman might be most fertile, though without the precision of modern science. Others spoke of foods or herbs thought to hinder conception. Still others debated whether the stars and planets influenced fertility, as the movements of the heavens were believed to shape all earthly events. It was not unusual for scholars to weave together medicine, philosophy, and astrology, treating them as threads of the same cloth. For them, the mysteries of life could not be separated neatly into compartments. The body, the soul, and the cosmos were all one continuous order, and understanding one might help to illuminate the others. Yet this learning was not freely available to everyone. The Latin in which it was written made it inaccessible to most common folk, who spoke only their local dialects. The books themselves were precious, each one requiring months or years of labor to copy. And so, knowledge of how to guide fertility remained enclosed, sometimes drifting outward through the words of a cleric, sometimes through a physician trained in university halls, but rarely reaching the market women or the shepherd's wife who might need it most. Instead, such women turned to their midwives, their mothers, and their neighbors. The silent halls of learning, though filled with careful thought, often remain distant from the practical needs of daily life. Still, the presence of these manuscripts mattered. For though many ideas about fertility in the Middle Ages might seem untested or uncertain, they laid a groundwork that would in time allow more accurate knowledge to emerge. They also served as a bridge, keeping alive the ancient wisdom of Greece and Rome until new generations could re-examine it. One might imagine, in a quiet scriptorium, a monk carefully drawing the lines of a diagram, showing the supposed structure of the womb. He did not know if the drawing was correct, nor did he need to. His task was preservation. By copying what came before, he ensured that knowledge, however imperfect, would not be lost. There were also whispers of more forbidden works, texts that spoke too directly of contraception or of ways to prevent conception by unnatural means. Such writings, when they surfaced, often drew suspicion. Some were condemned as dangerous, unfit for Christian readers. Yet others survived, hidden within collections or disguised under allegory. For example, a recipe might be written in such a way that only a careful reader would recognize its true purpose. A list of herbs, appearing at first to be for balancing the humors, might in fact be intended to discourage fertility. In this way, knowledge lived on, not openly, but in subtle traces. In these monasteries and halls, then, one sees both preservation and limitation. Knowledge was gathered, copied, and discussed, but it was also bound by the framework of theology and philosophy. If a teaching fit neatly within that framework, it was cherished. If it challenged it, it was often set aside. The result was a body of learning that was careful, methodical, and enduring, but sometimes distant from the practical needs of those outside the walls. And yet, when one imagines the slow turning of parchment leaves, the scratching of quills, and the steady hum of whispered Latin verses, it is easy to see how this atmosphere itself became a kind of cradle for thought. Even imperfect ideas, handled with such patience, had a way of carrying forward into the centuries. The story of how people in the Middle Ages thought about pregnancy, birth, and its prevention cannot be told without carefully stepping into the shadowed halls of the church. For in this age, faith was not a private matter. It stretched over the rhythms of daily life like a great canopy, touching everything. Work and rest, markets and meals, sickness and health, marriage and intimacy. And in this canopy, woven into sermons, rituals, and commandments, were ideas about reproduction, about what was considered acceptable, and about what was thought to offend the divine order. We move slowly here, as if entering an old stone cathedral on a quiet morning. The light is soft, colored by stained glass. Dust hangs in the air, turning every beam of sunlight into a kind of mist. The hush is not silence, but a gentle stillness. And in that stillness, the words of priests, bishops, and councils long ago continue to echo. The Church in the Middle Ages taught that procreation was not merely a physical act. It was a sacred duty, a participation in God's plan for the continuation of life. Each child born into a Christian household was a sign of divine providence. The scriptures were clear in passages that spoke of multiplying and filling the earth. And so, the idea that one might deliberately prevent a child from being conceived was not simply a personal matter of health or convenience. It was framed as a matter of morality, of obedience, and of sin. Yet the reality of life, as we have seen in earlier chapters, was often more complicated. Families did not always have the strength, or the food, or the land to raise many children. Women, whose bodies bore the weight of repeated pregnancies, often sought ways to find rest between births. The Church knew this tension, and the preachers of the age often spoke to it in both stern warnings and compassionate guidance. One of the clearest teachings came from the idea that intimacy within marriage had a rightful purpose: to bring forth children. Anything that interrupted this purpose, whether by deliberate avoidance of conception or by indulgence in pleasure for its own sake, was regarded as disordered. Church writers sometimes borrowed the language of natural law, saying that the body had been designed by God for a certain end, and to thwart that end was to turn against His will. Theologians such as Augustine of Hippo, whose writings carried authority throughout the Middle Ages, spoke forcefully on this matter. He described marital intimacy without openness to children as lust, and therefore sin. Thomas Aquinas, centuries later, would echo similar thoughts, teaching that to prevent conception was to interfere with the natural order of creation. And in local parishes, where ordinary men and women came to confess, priests were instructed to remind their flock that such practices were grave offenses. But if we pause for a moment, we may ask, what exactly did people confess? What did they whisper in hushed tones in wooden confessionals or before the altar? The records are sparse, but in penitential handbooks, guides written for confessors, there are lists of sins and corresponding penances. Among them, we find references to those who give potions to prevent conception, or those who corrupt the act of marriage. The penances might be long periods of fasting, exclusion from communion, or pilgrimages to holy sites. To understand this, it is helpful to imagine the medieval mind, not in modern terms of individual choice, but in the language of community and salvation. A sin was not only against one's own body, but against God, the Church, and the order of society. To seek to prevent pregnancy, then, was to disturb the harmony that bound family, parish, and heaven together. At the same time, not all voices in the Church were equally severe. In pastoral letters and sermons, some priests acknowledged the struggles of poor families or the dangers women faced in childbirth. There are hints that, at least in private, some confessors showed leniency, understanding that human frailty often collided with lofty ideals. A priest might admonish a couple, but also remind them to pray for strength and forgiveness, recognizing that not every action stemmed from wickedness, but sometimes from desperation. There were also places where folk practices slipped quietly into Christian households. A charm or prayer might be carried as a talisman against pregnancy, and while the official church denounced such acts as superstition, many parishioners blended them into their spiritual life without hesitation. They did not see a sharp line between faith and folk belief. Rather, both were woven together into the fabric of daily living. Monastic writers, who devoted their lives to purity and discipline, sometimes looked upon the struggles of ordinary couples with a mixture of distance and pity. For monks and nuns, celibacy was considered the highest calling, a way of imitating Christ and awaiting the kingdom of heaven. Marriage was permitted, but seen as a lesser path, tolerated for the sake of procreation. And so, the suspicion of anything that seemed to diminish procreation was strong among these voices. We may also notice that the church's view of women shaped its stance on these matters. Women were often regarded with ambivalence, honored as mothers, revered in the figure of Mary, but also feared as sources of temptation. Writings of the time often described women as weaker in will, more prone to sin, and thus in need of guidance and control. To seek to avoid pregnancy could therefore be interpreted as a sign of selfishness or rebellion, a refusal to accept the role assigned by God. Such ideas weighed heavily on the hearts of women who carried both the expectations of society and the burdens of their own bodies. And yet, beneath these stern teachings, there were softer notes as well. Prayers for safe childbirth were common, blessings for mothers were given, and saints were invoked for protection. The church did not deny the dangers of pregnancy. Rather, it sought to surround them with ritual and divine comfort. But it offered no official sanction for preventing pregnancy altogether. That remained beyond the line of what was permissible. To picture all of this, let us return again to the quiet of our imagined cathedral. A woman kneels before an altar, her hands clasped, her head bowed. Perhaps she is weary from many children, her body thin, her strength fading. Perhaps she has whispered her fears to her confessor. The words she hears may be stern, reminding her of duty and the will of God. Or perhaps they are gentle, offering comfort and urging patience. But either way, she knows that the church's gaze is upon her, shaping what she may hope for, what she may choose, and what she may dare to do in secret. The influence of the church was not simply in the laws it proclaimed, but in the invisible weight of its moral presence. It lingered in households, in the language of marriage vows, in the fear of sin, and in the hope of salvation. To live in the Middle Ages was to live beneath this presence, whether one embraced it fully or sought, quietly and cautiously, to bend its rules. The world of the Middle Ages, as we have wandered through it together in this long and quiet exploration, was shaped not only by the laws of medicine, by the knowledge of midwives, or the stern pronouncements of the church. It was also shaped by silence. In a time when words carried weight, and when reputations could be made or unmade by whispers, silence became its own form of survival. There were things not spoken, questions not asked, and matters left unmentioned. Among them was the delicate subject of pregnancy prevention, a topic wrapped in layers of modesty, secrecy, and sometimes shame. Tonight, let us slowly enter this world of quiet omission. Imagine not the bustling marketplace or the noisy hall, but instead the still hush of a dimly lit cottage, where the crackling fire is the loudest sound. Here, conversation moves carefully. Some things are never voiced directly, yet they shape behavior, choice, and life in profound ways. We move at a gentle pace through this landscape of unspoken matters. We notice the pauses in dialogue, the lowered gaze, the hushed tone. We notice the silence itself. In the medieval world, modesty was not only a personal virtue, it was a social expectation. Women, especially, were expected to be discreet in matters of their bodies. To speak openly about sexual matters was seen as immodest, even sinful. And so many conversations never happened. Mothers might wish to advise their daughters about the rhythms of their bodies, about herbs or cautions, but they hesitated. Sometimes, a quiet piece of knowledge was passed on in the form of a simple gesture, a gift of a small bag of herbs, or a cryptic warning. More often, it was left unsaid, in the belief that innocence and ignorance were intertwined, and that knowledge itself could lead to temptation. Silence became a veil, intended to protect, yet often leaving young people unprepared for the realities of marriage and childbearing. Married couples, too, often did not speak plainly about the matter of children, whether too many had already been born, or whether the household could afford to raise more. A husband might leave decisions to his wife without ever putting it into words. A wife might practice a quiet method of timing or herbs without explanation. Their silence was mutual, understood, and rarely disturbed. Sometimes, the silence was tinged with shame. A woman who tried to avoid pregnancy might fear being judged as unnatural or even ungodly if her husband knew. A man who avoided fatherhood might fear being seen as weak or lacking in virility. And so they continued together, saying little, carrying their thoughts within. Silence existed not only within households, but within the broader community. Villages were places where lives were visible. Neighbors noticed patterns: who was expecting a child, how often, and how many children survived. Yet direct questions were rarely asked. To pry into such matters was considered intrusive or even offensive. Instead, there was watchfulness. A woman who gave birth year after year was admired for her fertility, even if her body suffered under the strain. A woman who bore few children, or none, might attract quiet suspicion, though no words were spoken aloud. People drew their conclusions in silence, while outwardly maintaining politeness. Shame often clung to these matters. For a woman, the inability to conceive could bring quiet sorrow. For another, the opposite problem, the inability to prevent conception, might weigh as heavily, though this was seldom acknowledged. To say it aloud would be to admit to a wish that was frowned upon. Young women who found themselves with child outside of wedlock bore the heaviest silence of all. Words were whispered about them, but not to them. Families often kept such situations hidden, arranging hurried marriages or, in harsher cases, sending daughters away to convents. For the young women themselves, there was rarely any space to speak their own feelings. Their voices were absorbed into silence, their shame carried quietly in their hearts. The world of the Middle Ages was not divided neatly into categories as we imagine them today. We might be used to separating medicine from magic, or faith from science. But for those who lived centuries ago, the boundaries were soft, shifting, and uncertain. What we might call remedies, and what we might call rituals, often existed side by side, woven together into daily practice. A woman seeking to avoid an unwanted pregnancy might consult a healer, and she might be given a poultice or a drink made from herbs. Yet alongside it, she might also be advised to whisper a prayer, to wear an amulet, or to recite a verse at just the right moment. For the people of the Middle Ages, these things were not contradictory. A charm was not seen as opposed to a remedy. Instead, both belonged to a single world, a world where forces both visible and invisible shape the body and the soul. To understand how pregnancy prevention was thought about in this age, we must step into this blended landscape, where medicine shaded into magic and magic into medicine. Imagine, for a moment, a quiet cottage at the edge of a village. The air is heavy with the smell of dried herbs hanging from the beams above, their stems tied together with twine. The room is dim, lit only by a small fire in the hearth. A woman sits across from a midwife or healer, speaking in hushed tones. Perhaps she is young, perhaps already a mother of several children, weary from years of bearing and nursing. Her request is discreet, but the healer understands. In such moments, the response might come in two forms: an herbal mixture to drink and a whispered set of words, an incantation spoken at the time of the new moon. Both were considered necessary. Both belonged to the same realm of care. It is not uncommon to find medieval manuscripts where herbal recipes are interwoven with phrases of blessing or charm. For example, a healer might instruct a woman to take a plant such as rue, known for its bitter strength, and to steep it in wine before drinking. Yet, at the same time, she would be told to recite a phrase, perhaps a verse of scripture, or perhaps words of much older origin, passed down orally from mother to daughter. The act of speaking was not considered separate from the act of swallowing the remedy. The words gave the medicine its power, or at least enhanced what the plant could already do. Silence was sometimes seen as dangerous. One had to utter the proper words to guide the forces of nature in the right direction. The plant alone was helpful, but the plant with words was stronger. Objects, too, stood in the uncertain space between medicine and magic. A small pouch, sewn from cloth, might contain dried herbs or the scrap of a written prayer. This pouch could be tied around the waist, close to the womb, as a protective measure. Was this medicine in the sense of affecting the body, or was it magic in the sense of warding off unseen forces? The medieval mind rarely asked such a question. Both explanations might be true at once. Sometimes, these amulets contained substances we would now call medicinal, such as garlic or pennyroyal. Other times, they contained things that we would consider symbolic, a piece of parchment inscribed with holy names, or even a pebble from a certain stream believed to hold special powers. To the people who used them, there was no sharp distinction between chemical effect and spiritual influence. The heavens also guided practices meant to prevent pregnancy. The phases of the moon were thought to have direct influence over the body, especially the cycles of women. A healer might recommend that intercourse be avoided at certain times of the month, or that herbal preparations be taken during specific lunar phases to ensure their effectiveness. Here, again, the line between medicine and magic blurred. To look to the stars was not necessarily to perform sorcery, but to observe what was believed to be the natural order of things. The cosmos itself was seen as a vast body, in which the human body was a reflection. To align one's actions with the moon was as rational in medieval eyes as adjusting one's planting of crops with the seasons. Because of the moral weight surrounding sexuality, many of these practices were kept secret. Women might not speak openly about them, but they remembered the advice of their mothers and grandmothers. Healers might not write down all that they knew, but whispered it in confidence. This secrecy contributed to the mingling of medicine and magic. When something cannot be discussed publicly, It tends to gather a veil of mystery. Practical advice, such as using certain herbs to limit fertility, could not be entirely separated from whispered charms, because both were spoken in the same hushed tones, passed on in the same way. Over time, what was empirical and what was symbolic grew so closely tied together that it was difficult to distinguish one from the other. From the viewpoint of religious authorities, this blending of medicine and magic could be troubling. The Church was wary of charms and incantations, especially those not drawn from Scripture. Yet, at the same time, it tolerated certain practices if they were wrapped in Christian language. An herb accompanied by a blessing might be acceptable, while an herb with words of unknown origin might be condemned. Still, in daily life, these distinctions blurred. A woman in need would not always pause to consider whether her healer's words were approved or not. What mattered was that the advice seemed to work, or at least that it gave comfort. In times of uncertainty, reassurance itself was a kind of medicine. In this world of overlapping practices, the figure of the healer or midwife played a central role. She was not merely a dispenser of plants or a reciter of charms. She was a mediator, a bridge between the natural and the supernatural, between the known and the unknown. Her skill lay not only in knowing which herb might be useful, but also in knowing how to weave it together with the right words, the right timing, the right gestures. This knowledge was experiential, practical, yet also symbolic. It did not belong solely to the realm of science, nor solely to religion. It existed in the blurred space in between, where daily life unfolded. We might also consider the emotional role of these practices. To take an herb was one thing. To take it while also reciting a verse was another. The ritual itself offered a sense of order, of doing something meaningful. For women who felt little control over their bodies and their circumstances, the act of combining medicine with ritual may have provided a quiet form of empowerment. Even if the herb was ineffective by our modern standards, the ritual might still soothe the mind, ease the heart, and create a sense of agency. In this way, medicine and magic work together, not only on the body, but also on the spirit. When the last embers of the Middle Ages began to fade, and the dawn of the Renaissance slowly illuminated Europe with new ideas, not everything old was left behind. Much of what was practiced, whispered, or written in the centuries of medieval life survived, sometimes in plain sight, sometimes quietly hidden between the lines of manuscripts or preserved in memory and custom. This silent legacy of medieval knowledge is not one of thunderous revelations, but of gentle continuity. In monasteries, where monks once copied books by candlelight, their patient hands left behind more than prayers and hymns. Alongside the scriptures were marginal notes, lists of remedies, fragments of herbal recipes, drawings of plants thought to heal or protect. These scribbles were not always meant to last for eternity, yet somehow they did. Passed from one copyist to another, they carried within them the murmur of medieval thought into later centuries. In villages, too, the legacy endured. Folk knowledge, carried not in books but in the spoken word, remained woven into daily life, the memory of which plants eased childbirth pains, which teas soothed a restless cough, or which charms might guard against misfortune, lingered in families for generations. Grandmothers taught their daughters, and fathers repeated to sons the things their ancestors had once learned. Even as official medicine moved toward science and anatomy, the simple remedies of medieval fields and kitchens were never entirely abandoned. This legacy also lived in rituals and customs. The crossing of oneself before entering a sick room, the hanging of herbs over doorways, or the belief that certain days were more auspicious for medical treatment. All these continued well past the Middle Ages. What had once been taught as sacred knowledge shifted into tradition, but it did not vanish. Instead, it softened into habit, into the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. At times, the legacy was hidden in plain view. A doctor of the 17th century, armed with the new languages of anatomy and chemistry, might still prescribe a poultice that his medieval forebears once trusted. He might consult a plant long catalogued by herbalists of old. Though cloaked in new words, the roots of practice stretched back to an earlier soil. This silent inheritance was not only practical, but also symbolic. Medieval ways of thinking about health and the body taught that life was fragile, that sickness could not always be mastered, and that healing required patience, faith, and balance. Even as modern science grew, this older lesson, the humility before the mysteries of life, remained a thread that could not be cut. The silence of this legacy lies not in absence, but in quiet endurance. Like an echo across time, medieval knowledge remained part of the background, neither loudly celebrated nor entirely forgotten. It survived in the libraries of scholars, in the rituals of households, in the recipes scribbled on the back of parish books, in the prayers whispered beside bedsides. And so, the Middle Ages continue to live in subtle ways. Each time someone lays a sprig of herbs on a windowsill, lights a candle in a moment of hope, or turns to an old family remedy, they repeat gestures once common to medieval lives. The past does not vanish. It lingers, silent yet steady, shaping the present in ways often unseen. This is the legacy of medieval knowledge, quiet, patient, enduring, not in grand monuments or dramatic proclamations, but in the soft continuity of human experience, in whispers, in habits, and in the steady persistence of memory.